I'm guilty of being the furry and feathered type of whatever file. But I also study population genetics of tigers, and my interest is really to try and understand the past, thinking that maybe an understanding of the past will help us think a little bit about the future. So one of the things which people talk a lot about when talking about, so when you talk about the future, you're talking about, well, for some things, possibly extinction. And theoretically, we think that small populations are more prone to extinction because of genetic, demographic, and environmental stochasticity, right? Chance events which might push these populations to extinction. And so the tiger is actually a flagship for a lot of conservation efforts. And for example, if you go to the website of, say, Panthera, which is this big nonprofit for tiger conservation, they all kind of harp on numbers. So they talk about, you know, a 50% increase in tiger numbers over the next 10 years or whatever. And there's several other, you know, you can look at, you know, other kind of examples of this. There's another organization called the Global Tiger Forum, which also talks about increasing double or nothing, you know, doubling the number of tigers by 2022 or whatever. So I guess my question is, tiger conservation all about numbers? And can we have viable populations without them being connected in the absence of gene flow? Given this question, what is connectivity today, and how is it actually affected by the real landscape in which these species live in? So what we have done is to basically try and understand the past, think about the future with simulations, look at the present using some very exploratory landscape genetics kind of techniques. I'm going to pose in the end questions about other carnivores, and then finally, maybe if we have time, think about how we move towards the future. So tigers, of course, had a much larger historical range. They now live in about 7% of their original range. So this is the historical range, and these brown spots or splotches are optimistic representations of current range. So the first question we actually asked several years ago is, how have numbers changed? So we did this with nuclear genetic variation from tigers across the Indian subcontinent, and we used coalescent models to look at population decline in a Bayesian framework. So basically we asked, what was if there was a bottleneck, what was the population size, effective population size prior to the bottleneck, what is the size post-bottleneck today, and when was the bottleneck? So this just shows posterior distributions of that analysis. So basically our results indicated, first of all, you can see, so posterior distribution is basically after you do the analyses, what's the distribution of possible effective size values, right? So you see, for example, pre-decline effective size is higher than post-decline effective size. This suggests it's a bottleneck, a decrease in population size, right? And this is a log scale, so it's actually an order of magnitude change. And it also turns out that we can try and estimate the timing of this decline, and it's about 200 years. That's the median estimate of this posterior distribution. And it's kind of interesting that actually around this time is when bounty hunting was started by the British. So basically, if you hunted a tiger, you actually got reward money. So potentially, while there are, for example, Mughal texts which describe hunting of tigers, you know, this kind of correlates with you know, when bounty hunting was started. But again, like we kind of briefly discussed yesterday, this is just one. If I force the data to detect one bottleneck, this is when I find it to be. But there's potentially, you know, decline earlier as well, and so on, which I'm not picking up here. So I wanted to try to do that a little bit more. And the only way, so what do I want to do? I want to say, was there decline? Was there more decline in the last 100 years? Slightly less between 200 and 100 years, and so on, okay? So I want to have these windows of time in which I want to try to look at demographic history in some sense. So the only way to do this, as far as I understand, there's two ways to do this. One is to use these markers called SNP STRs. and I did some work on these in my postdoc. But they are basically a SNP linked to a microsatellite. And if you know the age of this SNP, okay, this mutation, and look at the variation on the microsatellite linked to this, you can potentially say something about what happened after that SNP evolved. Okay, and I can discuss this with any of you interested. But these markers haven't really taken on very much because they're quite difficult to genotype. We know that, for example, SNPs are much easier, and now people are looking at genomes, right? The other way is actually to go back in time. So you can do this if you have, for example, ancient DNA, right? We couldn't go back very far. There's not a lot of tiger fossils. But we actually did go to the London Museum and got a bunch of tiger skins. So this is a skin from Afghanistan, actually, where tigers are currently extinct, and it's about 150 years old. Of course, the sampling is in no way perfect, right? But basically, the question we asked is, are numbers all that we have lost? Have we lost something other than numbers? So we used, for this study, 53 skulls and skin samples, and they varied in age between 100 and 200 years. And they were collected from the British Museum simply because there are records of most of these specimens. So we know where they are from. So for example, there are some specimens we have, say, in India, but we sometimes don't know the provenance, geographically where they are from. Okay, for some of them we do, but yeah, so this just shows you that also what we try to do is to kind of maximize historical sampling, which is in red, in areas where, historical sampling is in black, where tiger populations are currently extirpated. And what did we find? Just from a perspective of raw genetic variation, okay? So this is, sorry, it's a bit faded, but this is a haplotype network for about 1.3 kb of mitochondrial data. And basically, a haplotype network is just a way to show what variation is, okay? So each of these balls is a unique spelling of that 1.3 kb, and it's connected to others by mutations or the number of differences, okay? So first off, you can see that the red are basically the modern haplotypes, or haplotypes in current tiger populations, but the blue are historical. And the first thing you might notice is there's not much sharing between the reds and the blues, okay? So for example, if we had just lost numbers, not particular haplotypes, just that, you know, tigers are now scrunched into a smaller space, but all of the kind of existing genetic variation from historical times is still retained, we would see a lot of sharing between the red and the blue. And we don't see this. And we can do simulations to kind of suggest that this is not because of differences in sample size, because definitely there are differences in sample size. But we also looked at the microsatellites, and these data, I think, are much more interesting. I'll tell you first what they show. So basically, this is a structure plot of tiger populations. And so when you look at modern tigers alone, the highest value of K, or the most likely value, not the highest value, the most likely value of K is 3. So there are 3 tiger populations in this. So this is the modern tigers in this data set, okay? And it's basically kind of partitioning the Tarai, which is basically the foothills of the Himalayas. This whole huge landscape seems to be one population, and then the semi-arid, which is actually represented by few populations now, seems to be a different population overall. Okay, there are some blips. However, when we, for this analysis, because we didn't have high enough sample size, we actually added in the historical samples, okay? And then we see that it basically, what happens is you basically get 2 populations. So these data suggest, and you can see this in the FST as well, basically for historical and modern data with microsatellites, you have a lower population structure and much higher population structure in the modern samples alone. So I mean, it's quite, actually it's not, it might seem, but to go back to this haplotype network and imagine all those blue balls actually disappearing, okay? So what you will have is actually a network filled with a lot of holes, fewer connections in some sense, And so because of that, you have more differences between different populations and higher population structure. Yeah. Not exactly, but we've tried. Sort of, roughly, yeah. Different locations. Oh, yeah. Sure. So we've actually, I mean, the paper details, like we've looked at it from different perspectives of populations, and definitely see what's happening is that in modern there's very few populations here, right? So we don't have a lot of modern populations there. But what we would like to do is to actually sample peninsular India much more extensively in the past population, because we're not really, and I'm not presenting that, but we couldn't pick up differences or changes in kind of slope of decline or anything like that. Our data did not have enough power. So we would want to do much more sampling here, just here, and look at that more. But so actually, what I was curious about then is how do we maintain existing genetic variation into the future? So what we can ask then is, we know that there was a past population size, and currently the population size is lower. So if we were to go 150 years into the future, how many tigers do we need to simply maintain existing levels of genetic variation? And we did this again in a coalescent framework, except that we modeled two samples, one from the present and one from the future. So it doesn't really matter. I mean, what we've used is the coalescent called the serial coalescent, where you can have branches coming in. But in this case, we have the future and the present that we're modeling. This is a collaboration with Rachel, who's a PhD student at Stanford. And so basically, what we found is, if we have, say, 5 populations of tigers, and they are just completely separate from each other, that's this scenario, in order to maintain existing levels of variation, the numbers of tigers you need is very, very high. Whereas if we have gene flow between these populations, it's very low. And this makes sense, because most probably tigers were pretty panmictic. I mean, not panmictic, but there was probably a lot of gene flow across their range. Okay, they're huge animals. Just from an allometric prediction based on body size, you would expect a median dispersal distance of 500 kilometers. Okay, so this is not that large, probably, to be surprised that there might be much less population structure in the past. Okay. On the other hand, if we just look, say, at peninsular Indian tigers, again, if we have 1% migration between populations, the number is really high. But with panmixia, of course, we don't really need a lot more tigers than we have even now. But if we have 5% or 10% migration, it's higher, whatever. And finally, if you just think of, say, the Western Ghats or Southern Indian populations, there's just no way you can actually maintain existing levels of variation into the future. So how do we put these kind of different studies together? Okay. So basically, our data so far suggests that tiger populations have declined significantly in the last 200 years. This is not a surprise, but it's nice to get independent validation. There seems to be local extirpation, which has caused potentially the loss of genetic variants. And there could be a behavioral reason for this. With mitochondrial DNA, females inherit the territories of their mothers. So over time, a mitochondrial haplotype would get correlated with a geographical location. And so if you lose a forest, you might potentially lose that haplotype as well. And there seems to be an increased genetic differentiation between populations. So simulations suggest forward looking into the future that an impossibly high number of tigers will be required in the absence of gene flow between these populations to maintain current genetic variation, right? But throughout our studies, something which has been really surprising almost is that all of peninsular India seems to show up as a single population. Okay, so basically the next question we asked is, how far are tigers really moving in peninsular India today? So how do we do this? We use a landscape genetics framework for this. We're basically doing population structure, population genetic analysis, but trying to hopefully incorporate features of the landscape. So not doing it spatially implicitly, not assuming that space has no consequence, but that different types of landscapes have effects. So we did this in the central Indian landscape, okay, and this is just a forest cover map to show you that there's a lot of fragmentation. These protected areas are extremely small, okay. So anyway, we did a lot of sampling, 4,000 kilometers walked, blah, blah, blah. But most importantly, while the sample sizes may seem small, we've sampled about 30% overall of the abundance of this area, and we've also genotyped 14 microsatellite loci, which are quite variable. I forgot to mention that we use fecal samples as a source of DNA. So this is just to show you also that there's some parks which are pretty far from each other, others which are much closer, but there is a gradient of distances between these different populations, protected areas, right? And first of all, just the standard population genetic statistics. So you can see that FST is significant in almost all cases, and it varies between about 0.07 to 1.16 and so on. So it is definitely low, but it's not that low. Because we're interested in recent gene flow, not really historical. FST gives you some handle on historical gene flow. We chose to look at another statistic called DSP. It's just the shared number of alleles, and simulations have suggested that it's a better representation of what's happened, in the last few generations. Okay, maybe 5 generations or so. For tigers, that would be maybe 50. A generation is about 5 years, say, 25 to 50 years, something like that. But we could have used, so there are other methods which estimate recent migration rate, like BIMR and BASAS and so on. And we've done that, but the thing is that often those are estimates, and there's a lot of variance about them. And so to do models where you're looking at a Mantel test, which I'll show you, they're probably not ideal. So what did we find? So first we looked, and this is just indicative. So I should stress that we've used assignment tests to look for potential movement, and these are not to be taken as definite dispersal, right? They're just potential indicators of dispersal, and we've used algorithms in structure which suggest that 4 individuals are moving. We've used gene class, which is a more liberal method, and for example, here you see the individual, and here you see the probability that it is genetically from brown, which is this place, TATR, whereas this individual cannot be unambiguously assigned to any particular population, right? And then this is an approach called SCAT, which basically uses, it's been used for African elephant ivory tracking, and you can basically try to see, assuming some kind of a continuous distribution of allele frequencies, where would you assign individuals to. So basically, you can actually, for example, here you can see, okay, so this individual was, say, sampled from here, okay, the blue, and it was genetically assigned to this population, for example. And then you can also see here some density kernels, 99 and 95% density kernels. So we're hoping that, if we use different approaches, we might get hopefully a better, some more confidence in our results. And basically, from various perspectives, this is kind of the very liberal perspective, but we see a whole lot of movement, and very surprisingly, very long distance movement. The red lines just show kind of bidirectional, potentially dispersal. So, so just to kind of reiterate what those results mean, it seems like in this area, connectivity is high and movement appears to be over larger distances. But definitely all protected areas are not equal. If you stare at this a little bit, you will see that some protected areas like Kanha here, it's like a hub. There seems to be a lot of movement into and out of Kanha. Some other areas, like this one here, seem to be isolated. And surprisingly, this guy, we threw in this population because it was so far away, and we expected there to be very little movement at all. But it doesn't seem to be isolated. So we wanted to ask further, what are the factors which correlate with connectivity? And so here we used a circuit theory approach. So this is basically where you have, so these are our same protected areas, right? And you have some landscape between, say, this and this, okay? Some real space, which is a mixture of agricultural fields, forests, villages, so cities, and so on. So if you assign resistance to each particular type of landscape element, and you look at, and then you calculate this kind of a heat map, which gives the overall resistance across the landscape. You try and correlate resistance between pairwise resistance with, say, DSP. For what types of resistance, what landscape elements do you actually get something which seems to be significant? So what we find is that human settlements seem to have a significant negative impact on connectivity. And of course, it's not that they are the only ones. There's a lot of other factors which do. In all cases, it seems like human settlements are involved. So while we can't say for sure, this very preliminary kind of exploratory study suggests that human settlements could negatively impact tiger connectivity. And this is just a connectivity map. This is basically signifying current flow. So these more purple values means there is connectivity, and here there's basically none. So for example, if we look at some protected areas which seem to be isolated, the question now is, can we actually predict something? So now we did this is very exploratory. So suppose now we have 15 protected areas, and based on our earlier studies, can we actually make predictions as to which should be well connected, which should be poorly connected, and actually test that in a more rigorous way. So also we are interested in how other carnivores see the landscape, and here we're trying to explore this in a body size gradient. So basically we have carnivores in India which are about 1 kilogram in size, and of course we have large things like the tiger. So for small things, we basically expect low dispersal distances. They won't move very far, while they might be more common in the population, whereas things like tigers would move large distances. And so if we actually looked along this gradient, we should see a gradient of FST. It's not immediately obvious what it should be, but you can actually model it and maybe test that. And this is just to show you a picture of some sampling we did in Kanha, that same area which seemed to be a hub. And you can see all these different species kind of popping up along this landscape. So using a unidimensional way, just tigers to actually look at this landscape, I think this is going to probably kill us. It's going to be a lot of work. But I mean, it'll kill my grad student, not me. But yeah, so it's going to be really interesting to actually look at, for the same landscape, how do different species actually respond. Some species like, this is a dhole, it's a wild dog, and this is a jackal. So jackals and jungle cats are really good at living in human-dominated landscape. So maybe, as you can see, actually, they're extending outside this protected area itself. And of course, the larger question is, how do we maintain connectivity? This is the protected area map of India. You can see, I mean, these little blips. So how do we actually maintain connectivity in the context of the tiger, say? So clearly, increasing the numbers in protected areas is not going to be enough. Can we actually make predictions about how to change the intervening landscapes? See, having jurisdiction within a protected area itself is difficult, like controlling poaching or whatever, right? Now you're talking about, you're hitting development. And for example, work we have done has been presented against a national highway which is coming up between two parks. So, I mean, we have to see how much we can actually, convert some of this into realistic predictions. I think that we're going to be too slow. By the time we get the data to actually answer very specific questions, it may take too long, but it might be worth trying at least. That's it. Oh, I finished very early. But if you have questions, we can talk. So this is actually work of a master's student, Aditya Joshi, who is so wedded to this landscape, he has never left. And Samrat Mandal, who was a PhD student with me and has been doing a postdoc with Sam Wasser. And Srinivas, who's an expert with GIS and stuff like of course, for other work, we've collaborated with Bruford and several other people, Liz Hadley and so on. Thank you. Kind of vaguely organized from south to north and east, northeast like that. But these guys seem to be continuous with Peninsular India. Now, maybe that's a sample size problem. I don't know. I'm not going to tackle that right now. But what we are doing right now is we're hopefully next month putting in a run for RAD, DD-RAD, where we have individuals from Peninsular India, semi-arid, Tarai, and the Northeast. And we can see whether maybe we're just completely wrong. I mean, I don't know. But hopefully if we have more data, at least we can ask those same questions again. Is Peninsular India one group? Does semi-arid seem to have split off relatively recently? Is the Northeast with Peninsular India, and so on, with many more markers. Huh. Yes. Sure. I really don't know. I don't know, but we do have, I think, maybe we have a sample or two in the run we're going to do. So maybe we'll know something. But all right, thank you.